Only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our 30 on Thursday, SusQtech's bi-weekly webinar series. Today we're going to talk about understanding SharePoint governance in 30 minutes. It's a big topic to cover in 30 minutes, so we're going to get going right away. Some quick housekeeping. For those of you, this is your first time, this is a bi-weekly 30-minute webinar series that we, SusQtech, put on. We've been doing it almost a year now. Our next webinar is scheduled for April 5th from 1:30 to 2, our normal time slot, and the topic of that session is no-code abstract management in SharePoint. So we'll get into how you can do abstract management using SharePoint without the need to write a lot of custom code, using a lot of the out-of-the-box features tied together. The full schedule of webinars is available at SusQtech.com/webinars. Again, today's topic is understanding SharePoint governance in 30 minutes. Our presenter today is Randy Williams. He's an MVP. He also works at AvePoint as their enterprise trainer and evangelist, and he'll talk a little bit more about himself when I turn it over to him. I am Steve Witt, and will act as the moderator. I'm the Vice President of Training and Product Development here at SusQtech. And one other reminder, for those of you in the DC area, our next in-person SUG meeting, SharePointUsersGroup.org, will be March 27th in Arlington, Virginia. The topic is the 5 things you should have done yesterday to improve your SharePoint lists and libraries, and that's also presented by somebody from AvePoint that's located down here in, it's going to be in Arlington. So if you're in the DC area, we'd love to see you at that event. Lunch will be served. It goes from 12 to 1:30 on March 27th. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn the session over to Randy, and he's going to talk about SharePoint governance.
Very good. Okay, thank you, Steve, for the introduction. So again, welcome to our session. Those of you on the East Coast, good afternoon. You're on the West Coast, as I am, good morning. I hope everybody's doing well. And so we're going to be talking about SharePoint governance here in about 30 minutes, which may be record time for trying to actually do something like that. And so let's go ahead and start it off real quickly here. And so I want to make sure that everyone is clear on what is governance. And I'm going to just hang on for just a moment as I get the presentation here going correctly. Steve, I may need you to jump in here. I'm not quite seeing the slides on my screen anymore. Let's see here. There's some advancement here that I need to make sure is working.
Oh, you're running in dual monitor mode. It might be on your...
That may be the reason here. Let's see here.
If you go
secondary.
Yeah, if you go to Show Screen, and then it should give you an option. This is in the GoToWebinar slide out menu. It should allow you to pick which screen you want to show. There you go.
All right, I'm showing it on both options. I don't see where my slides went. I'm going to close out of everything else just to make sure there's nothing else competing with real estate here. I apologize, everyone, for just a moment here. Let's get this squared away. Yeah, there's something odd here that's not quite working here. I'm going to stop showing. I'm going to start this again.
I'm seeing your PowerPoint now. I'm seeing the PowerPoint application.
Okay. All right. So then let's go ahead and is it in full presentation mode now? What slide do you see right now, Steve?
I'm just seeing the slide sorter.
Okay. Then I'm going to flip my other screen then. All right.
There you go.
You see? Yep. All right. Very good. All right. Apologies, everyone, while we got those logistics squared away. Okay. We're ready to start here. So again, let's talk a little bit about what is governance. And there's lots of definitions that you'll find out there for governance, and I'm just going to focus on one that I think is fairly simple, fairly short, which refers to the people, processes, policies, and technologies, really all 4 of those together that deliver a service for the business. Now, one way to visualize this, and I'm not really a big fan of what we sometimes call the SharePoint pie, but no doubt you've all seen that before as the collection of workflows that SharePoint delivers. Aside from each of those individually, another way to perceive this is think about the business that is going to be consuming the services and the functionality and ultimately the technology that SharePoint is going to deliver. Think about governance as being sort of that insulating layer that allows you to be able to build a service model that's going to be consumed by the business that deals with these processes, policies, technology, and people components that allow governance to, in fact, deliver the solution that the business is looking for. So it's just another way of sort of perceiving it, the relationship between the actual technology solution and, of course, what the business is trying to consume. Well, that said, let's talk a little bit about why governance might be useful in the organization. And as we go through this is going to be a bit of a visual overview, hopefully something that will give you some context about why governance is so important. And the first one that I want to talk about for just a moment here is accountability. One very important reason why we need governance is to really identify the owners, the content owners, that is, of the different areas of SharePoint. So who is going to be responsible for publishing content, let's say, on the HR portal? Or who is going to be the person that's going to be making the dashboard within the finance group available? And so accountability is that area where it's sort of this overarching responsibility where you can define those roles and responsibilities that those people have to make sure that the content is fresh and accurate and relevant to the organization. So if there's really any one thing that speaks to me, the people and the processes, and in some cases the policies around it, it's the accountability story. Well, there's also a quality story, making sure that the information that you do make available in SharePoint is going to be of the right quality based on the person that's going to be consuming it. So just a couple of small examples that we see as really key problems. Let's say that you have static pages of information, and that information just never changes. But the business, of course, does change, so the quality of that information is going to erode over time. You will want to make sure, of course, that there's some refreshing of that content to keep the quality high. Another common problem has to do with SharePoint versioning. As many of you know, SharePoint has both major and minor versions, and you'll see situations where content is oftentimes created and then left in a draft or minor state for potentially years, and it never gets to that point where it's never really published to version 1.0. And depending on how your security is set up, that could very well mean that the wrong version of information is made available. So just two small examples where quality comes in to make sure that the portal and the ultimate solution is going to be delivering the value that your business users expect. And what about the security element? Making sure that the proper security controls are in place so the right people have access to the right information. In some cases, this is going to be pretty obvious if you're talking maybe about some legal information or some HR information, but other areas of the portal may not be as clear in terms of who should have access. And so one of the things that governance should address will be those security policies around that content that needs to be made available. Typically, this would involve group management, whether it's going to be SharePoint groups or Active Directory groups, but making sure that you have a good grasp of the security capabilities and the flexibility that SharePoint brings is going to be key. And then along the same lines, I'll talk a little bit more about this later, is recognizing that SharePoint security is so flexible, and we can, for example, break what we call inheritance at many different levels. That can sometimes that can create security chaos. And so having that right balance of secure information but not complex and overly polluted in terms of permission management is going to be the right balance, is going to help you succeed with the solution. And then what about discoverability? Making sure that that content that you're going to be publishing out there is going to be accessible by the right people. Now, when we talk about the whole sort of information architecture of SharePoint, you're getting into how do you describe content, how do you organize it, how do you discover it, how do you navigate to it. The discoverability just refers to being able to access that content somehow, some way. Now, with the power of the enterprise search engine in SharePoint Server, there's of course some great capabilities to discover content that you have not just in SharePoint, but even outside of SharePoint. But it does, in many cases, go beyond just the search aspect. It's also making sure the navigation is going to be correct. And some of those are really challenging when you start looking into the larger farms that may have multiple site collections, and you have different, sets of top-level navigation that has to somehow all link together. And so that's going to be an area of governance you want to consider as well, to make sure that content, again, is going to be discoverable by your users. And I kind of like this one, maybe a little bit inappropriate, you might say. But seriously, being able to define what is appropriate content for your SharePoint environment is a critical part of governance as well. You might say that not everybody in the organization has the same, shall we say, moral compass. Some make good decisions and some maybe not so good decisions, as our fellow here on the screen. But really giving some guidance around what would be appropriate content and not appropriate content. Now, in some ways, SharePoint makes this fairly easy. For example, I can prevent people from uploading MP3 files into SharePoint through a web application policy. But it's not quite as easy if you're talking about appropriate information that, say, could be contained within a document. So, for example, there could be some policies that putting personally identifiable information, PII as we call it, inside a document may not be considered appropriate. And that's where you might need some third-party tools to possibly help out. What about proliferation? Another great photo. So think about how the ease of use it is to, for example, create new websites within SharePoint. And so not only can you create those within the browser, you can create those within Outlook if you're talking about, let's say, meeting workspaces. And so without any real guidance or control over how site proliferation can work, you really, kind of putting yourself into a situation where SharePoint can grow out of control, and all the other things that we're talking about in terms of accountability and quality and permissions become far more complex when you're talking about this structure of possibly thousands and maybe tens or hundreds of thousands of sites. So having some guidance around when do new sites get provisioned, how do they get created, who can create them, is all part of addressing the proliferation challenge. And then what about the actual lifecycle management of the content itself? Certainly have to agree that content goes through three distinct phases: its initial birth, its lifetime, and then hopefully there is some eventual disposition or death to that content. It's that latter phase that a lot of organizations really don't worry about, or at least they decide to ignore the issue for today. So for example, how many of you experience issues with, say, file servers, or maybe even SharePoint itself, where it tends to be a bit of a dumping ground for files? And so it's great to be able to file things in there, but there's really no process or procedure around how those documents eventually expire. How do websites get archived? How can I make sure that if there's really a records management component to this, that I'm enforcing a disposition policy that really requires me to make sure this information is expunged after a period of time? All those kinds of things follow into the lifecycle management. And again, they tend to be the things that organizations think about after the fact and not before. And if you worry about it after the fact, or you don't think about it until after the fact, now you get into another type of proliferation. It's just content proliferation, which creates content database bloat, which creates all kinds of performance and possibly some recovery challenges with being able to restore within SharePoint. And then this is another element of security, but the group management. And as your organization grows and possibly to thousands or tens of thousands of users, trying to figure out how group management is going to work across the different groups that SharePoint has. We know that you have Active Directory groups. We know that you have SharePoint groups. And SharePoint groups are going to be actually scoped to the site collection. So we have multiple sets of SharePoint groups possibly as each and every site collection comes into play. So again, users are going to need some guidance around how groups should be used. Who are the recognized people that are accountable for maintaining SharePoint groups and possibly Active Directory groups if you're relying upon those as your authoritative collections of users. And so again, having some procedures and guidance around group management is important. And we touched on this earlier, as I mentioned, the lifecycle management, but we do have to consider storage as an important part of your SharePoint investment. And really one of the big reasons is because the biggest cost, in fact one of the largest costs I should say, in a SharePoint investment is that what we oftentimes call the Tier 1 storage that's required for SQL Server. And when you're uploading content into SharePoint, and those that use it as a very heavy document store will very soon notice that the size of that content database and content databases tends to grow very quickly. And that can create, again, not only some performance challenges, but some storage costs as well. And how can I make sure that I'm still going to be staying within the recommended guidance and guidelines that Microsoft has for content database sizing? How can I make sure that the storage costs are going to be manageable? And How can I predict and trend what storage needs are going to be, let's say, next year? And so, again, having a good view of how proliferation is going to work, how lifecycle management is going to work, how archiving is going to work, because all those kinds of things will then point to the storage requirements that you have. And do I need to think about some other tools like RBS possibly that can externalize some of the storage and possibly use maybe some of the capabilities of some of the other storage vendors that are out there to be able to take advantage of some of their technology like deduplication and compression to help reduce your storage footprint. And then getting back to this issue that I mentioned earlier, this whole compliance aspect. For those organizations that are looking at SharePoint to deliver a records management solution, compliance is an absolutely essential area to consider. In fact, it's probably maybe the most important one from a governance point of view. And that's because there are laws that require them to enforce certain sets of policies. So, for example, there might be a certain set of documents that you have to make sure are going to be kept for a period of time, let's say 7 years, for example, and then after that, that period of time, there is a very clear disposal process where that information has to be completely expunged or wiped from the system. And so compliance definitely plays a role in your governance solution. It's just the extent to which compliance plays a role will vary. If you're in healthcare, then you've got HIPAA guidelines to think about. If you're in the real estate industry, you've got RESPA guidelines to think about. And many other organizations may have their own internal compliance policies that SharePoint needs to conform to. And then lastly, as we get towards the last of my visual images, is to consider the training element. And this is one that I'm sort of particularly passionate about because I am a trainer and I've actually been doing training for many, many years in my career, is to make sure that not only you're talking about these sort of policies and procedures, but you're really thinking about also the users themselves and making sure that they have the right guidance on how to use SharePoint correctly. Now, when people ask me to define governance, one other way that I like to consider it is the how-to guide for users. In other words, it's the how-to guide on how users should be using SharePoint effectively in their organization. And specifically, how can they use it to make their jobs easier, to make their lives easier? Because let's face it, if we're asking users to use SharePoint as yet another system within their IT collection of tools that they use, then they're not usually motivated to use it as a product. When you get to the training element, what you really want to focus on is not necessarily training people on how to just use SharePoint as a product, but rather how to use SharePoint to excel in your position. How can you use it to specifically improve the quality of your position? And that's a little bit of a more challenging effort because you really have to understand what governance is, and that governance plan then folds into what your training plan needs to be. So in that way, I think there's really some interdependence between governance and training. Training depends on governance, and governance depends on training to make sure that knowledge is shared across the organization. Okay, so now that that's said, let's talk a little bit about some strategies on how you can implement governance in your organization. Now again, this is a huge subject, so we're going to be taking it in a pretty sort of short, high-level kind of perspective. But here's some guidance that I'd like to share with you. First off, if you're thinking about a new SharePoint deployment or you have a SharePoint deployment in place but don't really have a governance plan, and you're starting to kind of put it together for the very first time, my first piece of advice would be to start small. In other words, don't try to establish policies to govern everything within your SharePoint environment. You'd be going from nothing to sort of the speed of light in an instant. That just doesn't work. It's way too much work to even create that governance plan, and it also would be way too much change for the organization. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Also at the same time, don't assume the plan will somehow materialize itself. In other words, and I see this in a lot of organizations, is they'll just deploy SharePoint, and it's sort of this sort of grassroots kind of deployment, and they'll let it grow organically. And I'm not against that entirely, but you can't assume that users are going to come up with all the right policies that are going to be the ultimately right solution for the organization. I think letting the users figure some things out makes sense, but I think there are also some sort of overriding governing principles that they're going to need some guidance on. I'll also talk a little bit more about that in a moment. A third point, and you'll read this across a lot of people that talk about governance, and I'm a pretty big believer on it as well, is you don't want to create policies on those things that you can't enforce. Let me just give you a couple very small examples. Let's say that you only have one web application in your SharePoint environment. So there's only just one URL where we're making content exposed to the organization. And despite having just one web application, you want to have a policy where some users can upload video files, but other users cannot. And assuming we're talking about just built-in out-of-the-box capability, that's something that SharePoint can't do. You can set blocked file types, but those file types apply to everybody across the board. I can't set them on a user-by-user or group-by-group basis. So SharePoint doesn't let me enforce everything that I'd like to enforce. Another small example, maybe more from a procedural point of view, is let's say that you want your corporate communications group to approve every bit of content that gets published on that top-level portal. That's a great idea, but what if you have so much content that needs to be published you don't have enough resources, enough staff to be able to do that approval process? You've now created a bottleneck. So think about the governability of your solution, but also think about the resource requirements and the technical capabilities that SharePoint can deliver to make sure that's going to be something you truly can enforce. And if you can't enforce it, you should definitely think twice about whether or not that's something you even want to identify as a policy. And then lastly, you do want to, if you're starting small, you want to grow your plan incrementally. And what I mean by this is oftentimes we encourage organizations to start their SharePoint deployment small. For example, SharePoint has all these different workloads, from enterprise content management to business intelligence to document management to portals and collaboration and social. It's got this great suite of capabilities, but in almost all cases, I would never suggest to deploy all that capability on day one. You start with a fairly small workload, maybe two, and you grow that out over time. So if that's how you're going to be leveraging SharePoint as a solution, that's also how your governance strategy should work. So you start small, you focus on the workloads that people are using today, and then you grow that out incrementally. So that said, your governance plan is in many cases a living, breathing entity that grows as your business grows and as SharePoint's use grows as well. And I want to talk a little bit more about this as we flip to this next slide, the readiness factor. You have to consider what the culture of the organization is when you're coming up with your governance strategy. So for example, let's say that your culture has been historically pretty lax. You don't have lots of policies and controls about what people can do. Maybe people are actually pretty well self-governing and they can kind of make good decisions on their own part. And if that has been your culture, and then you're going to a model where you're now going to rule things with sort of an ironclad approach, you're very, very meticulous and clear about what people can and can't do, that may not be the best from a cultural point of view. And so your organization may not be ready for that degree of governance. And they may never be ready and may not even be necessary. So definitely consider your maturity level in terms of where you are as an organization. You may want to make some improvements to what you're not doing well, but recognize you may have to take baby steps as you get to that sort of long-term goal of improved organizational readiness. Okay, so this is really more about the culture and the people and recognizing that people do adapt slowly and you can only do so much so quickly. You'll probably at some point want to create a governance board, and the governance board is going to really be that committee that is going to set some of those driving or framing decisions across the organization. Now, we usually advise you to keep this sort of cross-functional, and what I mean by that, this is not just the IT group saying what you can and can't do. It's hopefully going to be a pollination of different users in the organization that are going to have some say into what this should be. And since SharePoint involves HR, or rather since SharePoint and governance involves people, there should be an HR component. If you're talking about anything that would involve, let's say, some legal requirements, then absolutely legal needs to have a seat at that table. Maybe corporate communications has a role. So you're going to identify those people in the organization that can sort of work together as a committee, and it should not be a big committee. You want to have this be fairly small. In some cases it can be as few as 3 or 4 people, but I would say normally no larger than maybe 8 or 10. And that group, again, will not be setting everything across the board, but set some of those guiding principles and some of those framing decisions that can be made. So if you've got one person in HR that's helping to define the policies the framing policies around HR, it's the rest of the HR department themselves that will be working on the rest of those policies. So again, just to be clear, the governance board is not defining everything. They're kind of defining the high-level goals and the sort of driving decisions and some of the visions and principles that go into this, and that they then work with some of the other parts of the organization to flesh the more complete plan out. And then one other big part that I think, again, relates more to the training aspect of this is make sure that you are addressing that guiding or that guidance goal that governance is. How is SharePoint supposed to be used in certain ways? And so when we talk about proliferation, how should a website be created? Where should a website be created? Are you going to be using the out-of-the-box capabilities to be able to create a website? And if so, what templates, site definitions, as we would sometimes say, should be made available? Where should certain types of documents be stored? And that's a huge subject. It gets into content types and of course, you know, libraries and site collections and such, and really the ultimate classification of your content. As we talked about earlier, who owns this content? That speaks back to the accountability story. Who's the person that's ultimately responsible for making sure this information is accurate and secured properly and retained for the proper, you know, period of time if you're talking about a retention policy? You know, and then other things people are going to need help with. Do they still save files on the file server now that you're using SharePoint? Is there guidance around when they should still attach files to an email message? That's a big problem that many organizations have. You need to figure out how you can solve that. And in some cases, the solution to this problem may not just be SharePoint. Again, there might be some third-party products that you add into the mix to help simplify the way in which people are going to be using SharePoint in their day-to-day jobs. And then again, as this sort of overriding suggestion I have, I would make sure you incorporate this into your training plan. Now, this doesn't have to be a formal training program if you're worried about putting something, you know, that big in place. This could be very informal. These could be brown bag lunches. These could be internal communities that you set up in your organization to start to spread some of this knowledge. So, you know, using the community aspect of SharePoint and kind of working at that lower level, I think does work in a lot of cases, but you do want to make sure there's some structure and guidance around it, and of course that's where governance itself will come in. And then, of course, there's resources abound on the SharePoint governance story. You can just Bing governance or Bing SharePoint governance. You'll find, gosh, a plethora of content that's out there. Here are just a few of them that I wanted to focus on that I thought were maybe a little bit more useful and could help sort of constrain that result set that you have. Microsoft has put quite a bit of effort in creating their governance center. I've got a link on that. I've expanded this particular session here in a white paper that I wrote not too long ago that is that second link there. And then we're also working very closely with our colleagues out in the UK, a very, very great group of guys for working with a company called 21 Apps. And 21 Apps, they have all kinds of great materials on SharePoint governance as well, and what they like to call their pillars of SharePoint governance. I would recommend you go out there and see some of their stuff. It's very exciting. And again, sort of maybe like how some of these pictures came out, a slightly different visual perspective on how to approach governance in your organization. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and open up the floor to questions. Are there any questions that we can address?
Great, thanks, Randy. Yeah, if anybody has a question, please use the question window in GoToWebinar. Randy, I do have a couple questions for you. I guess one of my questions, where do you, with the organizations that you talk to, where are most people with governance? Are they, in terms of the implementing governance, are they just now getting started in the governance and they're doing it kind of after the fact, or they've had it since the beginning and they're in the adjustment phase? Where would you categorize that the majority of the people that you talk to, where they are with governance?
Yep, Steve, so super good question. My answer to that is not where I would like them to be. Where you actually see most organizations is very, very low on the maturity curve, and specific to what you said, I would say most of them do not have governance. They recognize that they need governance, but in a lot of cases don't know where to start. They're either worried that it's going to take weeks and months of time and it's never going to result in anything that will be of any practical value, or they, as I alluded to earlier, they just kind of think that it's going to grow over time. And so I think a lot of this has to do with, in some cases, the maturity of just the SharePoint adoption itself. For organizations that are using it for, let's say, very simple things, is just say maybe a bit of a document store and some very simple collaboration, and the governance, element is not as important. But as you're getting into really, some more mature use cases with enterprise content management and records management, it becomes so much more important. So typically we see organizations as they evolve over time, start small, grow big. As you get big, that journey has to, of course, consider governance and making sure that evolves along the way.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, I have a couple questions out here in GoToWebinar. So, we covered a very large topic in 30 minutes and couldn't get into a lot of detail. One of the questions is, where can you find actual questions to use for planning and putting together a governance plan? Any additional, I know you had the resources in there. Are there any other areas to go to find that information if you're putting together a governance plan and some of the questions you need to ask?
Yep, so that is a great question. I would say go ahead and start with the Microsoft Governance Center. They do have a template that you can take a look at that might be helpful. But one thing that I want to caution people about is to point out that how organizations use SharePoint varies widely from company to company. While there are some certain standards, some trends that I do see, but the overall uses are very different. And because of that, I think it's going to be hard to find that one template that's going to be right for the company. So as you're starting to find things, and again, starting with the governance center that Microsoft has is probably a good start. As you're looking at that, start to think about how these relate to how I'm using SharePoint, and view that as more as a concept than an actual, this is what I'm going to start with. So think about what you're trying to do. Think about the potential challenges that you might have, and in many cases, just having a few other ideas that are out there gives you this sort of road, at least the vision on what that road is. And in many cases, you come up with your own questions. That'd be my advice.
Great. I have another question here. This person, they understand that the governance board is a high-level team of mostly non-IT people, but these folks don't typically understand why they are there in such a role.
Yes.
Can you talk about engaging a governance board?
Absolutely. So it's another excellent question. And my answer to that is, and I think one of the sort of central points beyond this is it's not an IT group exclusively. In fact, IT maybe has a seat at most. Is to really focus on the business aspect of what you're trying to do. So if you're trying to deliver, let's say, a solution that's going to be, maybe I'm trying to come up with some type of solution that's going to be automating the processing of expense reports, just a super small, very common example. Think about what the very simple policies and procedures should be around that. So I would say focus on the business use cases, on how SharePoint's going to be used. Or maybe you're not even sure SharePoint's going to be used yet, because in some cases governance starts even before the technology is selected. So focus on the business side, focus on their challenges, what they think they have had issues with before, maybe in previous solutions that you need to address this time around. So having those lessons learned, I think, helps a lot. And keep technology out of this. Focus on the business, focus on what they need to do to solve problems, and then at some point later, then align this to what SharePoint will bring.
Perfect. And then I have one last question, and I was wondering if you could talk briefly about the role of governance as it pertains to adoption and adoption of SharePoint in particular.
Another good question. I actually tried to allude to that a little bit as I talked about the training aspect, and I'm going to come back to that for just a moment. But when we talk about adoption, I actually view adoption in a way where too much adoption is bad and too little adoption is bad. So for example, if you have too much adoption and without having a governance strategy in place, things just, again, with proliferation and content explosion, you tend to just end up creating this huge garden of weeds over time that really doesn't provide the value that the business expected. And on the other end, if you have too little adoption, I just have a few people that are collaborating, for example, I'm not really getting the synergistic benefits that my solution is intended. So I think adoption is a balance, and ultimately where I think governance comes into that, I think to me speaks to the training aspect. I'm a huge believer that some form of SharePoint training is necessary, but I'm also a big believer that just teaching people how to use SharePoint and expecting them to then apply it to their day-to-day job is something that usually fails. And that's something that we see most organizations do, right? I'm going to send you to a one-day SharePoint class, and once you go to that, you're going to come back and just be jazzed and excited, and you're going to be 50% more productive and blah, blah, blah. The reality is people are so busy and focused on all of their day-to-day tasks, they don't usually have time to reflect upon and come up with those specific ways in which SharePoint is going to solve problems, at least in general. Now, I know there's some people that are really good at that, and those are super useful resources to have in the organization. But the reality is people are going to need help to figure out how SharePoint is going to make their lives easier. So where governance, I think, should be coming in and where it gets folded into the training plan is as you're looking to build solutions for each of these different business units, again, let's come back to the expense report for HR, help the organization figure out then how should this be used to address what is a very common problem today. And when you focus on the problems within the organization, again, at the business level, not the technology level, I think you're going to very easily address the problem because people are going to want to use this system, not because they have to.
That was a great answer. I do have one other question that came in. Understanding that it's good practice to start small, what strategies have you found are there to deal with a situation when an organization is switching to SharePoint and they're migrating some complex workflows, databases, and other types of content?
Yep. Well, first off is to recognize that SharePoint itself is unlike any other platform that's out there. And so what that usually means is let's say the fidelity of the data that you're migrating into SharePoint may not map up exactly. So, for example, maybe you're moving from Lotus Notes and you've got a number of different custom workflow applications that are running in Notes. Well, that just doesn't, automatically migrate over into the workflow engine that SharePoint has. And so first off, there might be an IT element to this to, in some cases, literally rewrite how some of this logic works in SharePoint, or decide, if you're going to be doing it a little bit differently. So I think you really need to, again, go back to what the business requirements are, figure out if the solution that you have today still works, and if so, figure out how that can map over into SharePoint. But also at the same time, recognize that, again, SharePoint is a different solution, it's a different interface, it's a different way of solving problems that not everyone is going to understand or be comfortable with, or frankly even like to begin with, or maybe ever. And so again, I think that's where the starting small might make sense. You could in fact have both platforms in use for a while as you slowly transition from old to new. And I actually see that very commonly with some very big complex solutions like Lotus Notes and Documentum. And I know it's very expensive to maintain both systems at the same time, but just recognize the volume of work that goes into moving from old to new could itself just take months. And of course, you want to make sure that you can preserve the information and its context, and also be able to do so at the same way that you can address training and all the other governance requirements that are unique to SharePoint. So there's no one answer to that. The last thing that I probably would point out is there are a number of third-party companies that are out there that do have solutions that can help address that migration challenge, take away at least some of those technical aspects, but all the other procedural aspects and other things are something that you still need to deal with.
That's great. Well, Randy, I'd like to thank you for your time. Those are all the questions for now. If anybody does have any follow-up questions, Randy's information is on the screen as well as mine. Feel free to email us. And Randy, I think you covered a very large topic in 30 minutes. I would like to have you on again, maybe to deep drill one or two of these areas. So I'll reach out to you after the fact and see if we can put something on the calendar for a future 30 on Thursday.
I'd be honored to. Thank you.
And with that, again, thanks again, Randy, and that'll conclude this 30 on Thursday. We'll see everybody the first week of April. Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.